of the cows. So it's something that's quite interesting. Whatever the different type of solution, the idea is that you've got to rely on the biodiversity cycle of your farm. We had a few examples that were shown earlier today that were very, a very good demonstration of what can be done and with a very quick result in 3 years. But I would say, think organic matter, think about the structure of the soil, and if you have that idea and if you outreach to find the people who can help you, you will succeed. I don't know if I managed with my 10 minutes, try to be the shorter possible because, so Didi, the floor is yours.
Ecology of care about the resilience of the healthcare system, and started to think more about the resilience of landscapes and how that impacts public health. Most of our roads in Vermont are dirt roads, so that's kind of an interesting version of what happens when water hits soil. And if you notice on the sides here, the erosion didn't happen yet. And that's kind of a clue to what we're talking about today. Another issue in New England and all over the world is algae blooms. And here, this is Lake Champlain, north of me, of where Abe lives, and got beautiful farms all around it. But if you get up close, sometimes it looks like this. So that has to do with the soil structure also. As I was writing, I decided to change my career from healthcare to writing curriculum about soil health and watershed function. And as I was writing a piece called Walk in the Rain, that was supposed to have people out following little trickles of water during rainstorms, I got a call from Holmes. I was in the Adirondacks at that point, saying something's happening here. This was July 1st, a couple of years ago, and this is the road next to my house. And when I came home, that's what it looked like. So we lost a quarter of a mile of soil overnight, just a few inches of rain. I live in a town with only about 800 taxpayers. It's taken 2 years just to get this road repaired. 75% of the roads in our town were damaged by that storm. And we hadn't finished cleaning up from Irene. So the question is, can we take some of the money that is being spent currently on this kind of thing and put it into rebuilding what I call the soil sponge? To give you an idea of what the soil sponge is, I have a little horse and pony show that I do. Many of you have seen it, and if you've seen it before, think of this as an opportunity to memorize it so you can turn around and go do it at the State House or the road with the road commissioner or whoever. So So I use a plate of flour. We got a picture for those of you in the back. I use a plate of flour as a stand-in for the broken down rocks that are the sand, silt, and clay. That's the foundation of soils. And when in soil class we learned, oh, that's what soils are, but they're a lot more than that. They're that plus life. So who's got a nice ballpoint pen near the front? We have a partially made rain cloud made by a student at Bristol Community College last night. So we need to turn it over and turn it into a rain cloud.
Oh.
And then,
Well, you got-
just open up those.
You got holes in
That's
this.
what I was saying, yeah, student got it started for you last night. Who would like to be God?
There you go, now you're talking.
So, and who would like to be the goddess who fills up? The god? We need some water. Somebody has some water over here. Oh, yeah, of course. Maine Farmland Trust. Okay. So God and goddess are going to get together, fill that up. And we got a rain cloud. It's going to move across the landscape. Come on, rain cloud. Okay, we're going to rain on this soil. And we're going to see what happens when we have just sand, silt, and clay, no biology in the picture. And what's up? You better stop because we're starting to have a flood. Okay? Come on, walk with me. All right.
Backyard.
So we got, what do we see happening if this was a landscape?
Flood.
A flood, yep. What's in the flood water?
That's how clear that water is.
So we've got silt, we've got manure, we've got chemicals, we've got all kinds of good stuff happening. We also have some erosion happening. We've got soil sealing on the top of this. If we put this out in the sun, it would seal over. No rain would get in the next time. Not much got on this time. If you dig down, have the plant roots gotten any of that? No. Okay. So what do we need to do to turn flour into bread? What do we need to add? Only one thing besides moisture. Yeast, which is a microorganism. So when we add bile, it's not exactly the same thing. And don't worry, no actual microorganisms were harmed in making this bread. I got it in the gas station.
We need some more water. We need another cloud.
Okay.
We need the goddess again.
So when you turn flour into bread, you're basically taking all those little particles and you are sticking them together. You are aggregating them. And then if this was soil, life would move through and create holes. So the holes are created by particles sticking together, and suddenly there's some space, but also things moving through.
We only have 3 slices.
All right.
You ready?
Sure. What happens when we rain on healthy soil that is aggregated and has this structure? This is the soil sponge.
It's soaking in.
It's soaking in.
You good?
What else is
Go.
happening?
Just pour it all in there. We'll just go for it.
Jen, what else is happening?
It can hold more.
It can hold more. Typically, this can hold at least like 9 times as many cups of water.
Oh my gosh, there's no river there.
There's no flood. When it does finally come out, if we added 9 more cups, it would start to come out. It's coming out clean and clear because we have a physical filter, and in soil we also have a biological filter happening here. So it's physically filtered by the porosity, but it's also filtering it because the biology in there is breaking things down. If your kitchen sponge fell apart every time you put it in your dishwashing pan, would it be a sponge? No. So the same thing is true with a soil sponge. The part of what needs to happen is that it needs to have these biological glues. Think about dried egg white. You know, you're trying to clean that thing you made scrambled eggs in later in the day. Really hard to get water to break that down. So those biological glues are sticking those particles together into the sponge and holding it together when water moves through. So it's both permeable and porous, but it has this structural integrity and it's actually a little hydrophobic at the same time. So this is, if this whole landscape was like this, would the landscape be cooler? Yes, okay. Would there be more water soaking in?
Yes.
Yes, and would there be more carbon in the soil? Yes, so it would be cooler perhaps on a global scale because we're dealing with atmospheric carbon getting into the soil, but it's cooler instantly as soon as it's transpiring. So you got two things working for you climate-wise. Plus, we've taken care of flooding, we've taken care of drought, because this landscape, if you lived somewhere that got, 10 feet of rain, you'd rather have the bread, right? If you live somewhere that got 2 millimeters of rain every year, you'd still rather have the bread, because it's going to soak in and hold that water. So flooding and drought are two sides of exactly the same issue. Okay, Walter Yana, who I work with, has done some calculations. John Norman, the environmental biophysicist that Abe works with, checked those calculations on a very formal paper napkin, and they both say that approximately 4 to 5% increase in transpiration would cool the planet just through those latent heat processes. That's not talking about the soil moisture, that's not talking about the soil carbon that would happen if we got this going. And what that translates into on agricultural land is about a 25% increase in green growth, green transpiring growth. Can we increase cover crops by 25%? Yes, we can. This is very doable. This is taking care of the climate through the water cycle and the carbon cycle and letting biology do the work.
You said 4 to 5% increase in transpiration?
Yep, so anytime a plant is photosynthesizing, it's transpiring. Someone out here is going to come up with some way that that's not true, but generally that's true. Okay, I don't know where I'm at time-wise. Probably close. Few minutes? Okay. All right, here's another version of the same thing. Looking at, but this is, here we're talking about partly the shade that's provided, okay? That's a whole other thing that we haven't even gotten into. We're not talking about transpiration necessarily here. We're talking about that when you have a cover crop, this is same day, right next to each other. We're talking about shade, we're talking about re-radiated heat, we're talking about soil moisture, and all of those things impact the temperature. One thing I want to say, since I know I'm talking to people with different amounts of experience, but we talk about organic matter holding water. So I'm organic matter and I'm holding water, maybe even more water than I want to. So all organic matter holds water. If you put some dry leaves in a bucket, they're going to swell up and hold water. So that is true that organic matter in the soil holds water. That's different than the porosity of a soil sponge that is built by biological work. Okay, so you got both of those working in your favor when you have more soil organic matter. But if you just dump a bunch of leaves in the soil, they're instantly going to soak up more water, but they're not going to build a sponge for you. You need biology working for you. And that biology is fed by plants, having living plants in the soil that are pumping their sugars down to feed the biology, to kickstart things. And then by having a layer of dead decomposing plant litter that is feeding the decomposers. So it's those living roots in the soil that are growing, that are feeding that soil food web. Underground. This is a different fence line photo. This is put together by our colleague Peter Donovan. This is the Lake Champlain. A little hard to see here, but this is looking at the amount of photosynthesis happening over time in different pixels on the map. So the days of the year that the photosynthesis is over a certain threshold. So the white, the water is blue. We have the lights off. You can see that there is some white in there as well. And the white actually is some photosynthesis happening. Okay? And what we see is that the areas where there is less photosynthesis happening on land, there's more happening in the lake. What does that mean? Those are algae blooms. Okay. And speaking of public health, those are now associated not just with acute illnesses, if your dog drinks it or you happen to go swimming and think that it's really pretty turquoise lake, but also long-term neurological issues. So ALS and Parkinson's, etc. So last couple things in terms of thinking about how all of these things are connected, we can really address what we worried about with climate change. We're worried about heat. Okay, can we address heat? Yes. We're worried about flooding. Can we address flooding? Yes. We're worried about drought. Can we address drought? Wildfires. If a tree falls over here, it's going to rot. If a tree falls over here, it's going to turn into firewood. Right? Dust storms, maybe not specifically related to so much thinking about climate, but thinking about air quality in the Central Valley of California, where all your fruits and veggies are grown, is some of the worst in the country, or maybe the worst in the country. So if we blew on this, we were outside, get your kindergartners to blow on that. That's what's happening, and that's not just soil, that's the pneumonia-producing bacteria, that's antibiotic-resistant bacteria from feedlots getting into the air. So we can address many of our public health issues. We can address most, or not, if not all, of our climate concerns through the soil sponge. Okay.
I'm wondering where all of your props were in 1995 when I was trying to do this. Those are really cool. Thank you.
A lot of that and more is in a book called Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function. It's a free download at soilcarboncoalition.org/learn.
Great. Thank you. Do it.
So this is Stonewall Farm in Keene, New Hampshire. It's the last dairy farm in Keene, New Hampshire. There's about 120 acres of land here, and it was originally cleared back in the 1700s, and it's been in consistent agricultural use since that time, and it's consistently had a dairy since the mid-1800s. In the late 1980s, the last private owner, Norm Chase, who didn't have any heirs to pass the farm on to, transitional planning. We hear about it all the time in farming. It's a big issue. And he didn't want this land to go into development. It's in a prime area for development in Keene. He could have sold it for a lot of money, and that probably would have been a much easier process for him, but he wanted to ensure that the dairy continued and that the land stayed in agricultural use. Luckily, there was somebody who shared that vision, happened to live nearby, and had the means to preserve this land. And he had a vision of preserving it and opening it up to the public so that people could come and learn about agriculture. He saw that people were losing touch with the connection of how food was made, and that many children and adults didn't have an opportunity to go visit the farm. So today we still have the farm open to the public. Anybody can come at any time to visit. This is one of our pastures. We have 120 acres, only about 30 of that is in use as pasture. I think there's some potential to look at silvopasturing, which would be great. One thing you can't see here, and I just want to point it out now on this slide, but as our summers have gotten hotter, we've noticed that the cows, they need some relief. Heat stress is a big issue for here, and so they're congregating along the lines, and there's a brook over there as well, so they're looking for shade. So we're contemplating what can we do with some of the forested landscape to provide some of that relief. So at Stonewall Farm, we have a number of roles. We are a working farm. We have a dairy, we grow crops, and we also produce maple syrup. Those are our three main products. But we're also an agricultural education center. So actually some of the people from today are here. I think Didi is right there. Yeah. So, this was an event we held at the farm last fall. So that's one of our roles. We also provide farm-based education programs for schools. And we have summer camps, and it involves getting the kids involved in all aspects of the farm. My 10-year-old son is very actively involved, and his favorite thing is to clean the dairy barn, which comes in very handy. And one of the things I'll just mention now, for those of you that are interested in learning more about it, on May 14th through the 22nd, Byron Sheldon from the Savory Institute is coming to teach a holistic management class. So if you're interested, you can look on our website for more information on that. So this is our crops. We're small. We have about 3 acres of 3 acres in crop production, and our dairy we milk about 30 cows. So that's small scale. We started several years ago converting our tilled fields. We've been organic for over 10 years, and we were seeing a lot of weed pressure. And so we decided to try no-till. We converted our beds to permanent beds, so we don't till these. We rotate cover crops. We incorporated some bioconservation controls in partnership with the Diversity Society. And we're trying to add more species diversity rather than a monocropping system. And that's worked well for us right now. One of the things that we've been horrible at is taking pictures of the before and after, and we're not scientists. So one of the things in coming here today that I'm eager about is connecting with people who are the scientists who can help measure us. I was leaving this morning, I was showing my husband, he's an environmental science teacher, and he says, you need data, you need more information on, proving how this works. And we do, but right now we're in the middle of farming, and it's hard to find time to do both. So, I'm really thankful for events like this that bring people together so we can make those connections and share what we're observing anecdotally, and sharing that with the rest of the community. So we were working with the crops, we were growing regenerally, seeing good results. Meanwhile, the dairy, prices are dropping, even in organic. We have a limited land base. When you're a smaller operation, your labor and feed costs become quite high. You're not able to spread your expenses across a larger operation. And so we were trying to find ways to reduce our feed costs, and part of that meant improving our pasture. It had been grazed rotationally for many years, and the previous farmers who were managing the grazing system before said there's nothing we can do, it's just what it is, we don't have a lot of land. We talked with our NRCS rep about equip funds, and they told us, they did a typical mineral soil assessments that you needed to add X, Y, and Z to improve it, and do the cost share program, which we still haven't been able to make work yet for our farm. So meanwhile, there's got to be a more holistic approach, a more regenerative solution to this. So did some research, I learned about Abe's work, he came out to our farm, which was great. And then we also learned about the work of the Savory Institute. And so we started on that path, attended the training, and this past summer was our first summer implementing that at the farm. And already we've seen some really good results. So this is just one of our fields. And previously, we rotated the cows, but there wasn't any plan, And so what we did was we subdivided this. So before, the cows were just put here for several days, and they could just graze wherever they wanted. And so now what we're doing, we divided it up, and we keep them in a smaller area. There's a formula that we look at to figure all this out. But basically, what it comes down to in summary was we had shorter periods of occupation followed by longer periods of recovery. And that was a significant difference. And one of the things that we had looked at with the EQUIP grant was reseeding, buying some clover seed to reseed. And we had walked the pastures at the end of the season with another consultant that we work with, Sarah Flack. She's known for her grazing expertise, and we noticed that clover was already reseeding itself, and so we would have gone to spend money to do that, and here it is happening on its own. So that was significant for us. But these are just some of the early results that we're noticing. We doubled the intake in our pasture in just a year's time, which was significant for us because of the feed cost issue. This has a bottom line impact. We wanted to be good land stewards, but we were also seeking a solution to keep this dairy in operation because like every other dairy, we're struggling right now. That's a reality. So these were just some of the things that we noticed. Also, we had a nutritional analysis done. The quality of our feed was increasing, and that was significant too because that helped with production. And then there were sort of other fun discoveries, like we had an excellent dung beetle population, which is great fodder for our school programs. So we get to have a lot of fun with the kids out there for that. But I wanted to take this opportunity while I was up here because the other thing that we need to have happen is more partnerships like this and scaling up the work that we're doing. We're obviously working with the Savories Group. That's one organization that's trying to accelerate the practices. But there's a lot of other organizations that are working with that as well. One of the tools that we're using is ecological outcome monitoring. And so that is helping us look at outcomes. Earlier today we had a conversation, do we measure practices, do we measure outcomes? We're on the track right now of measuring outcomes and using that system developed by the Savory Institute, but also combining it with some water testing of the brooks nearby. We have a pig farm down the road too, so that'll be interesting to see. And then we have some developments up ahead, so that's going to be an interesting experiment. Let's see what else. Yeah. So the other thing I think that's important to happen, we need to change our food system and change it radically and be bold about it and establish regional food hubs and markets. If you notice today, I mean, the culprit really is cheap food. You know, we want cheap food. We don't want to pay a lot for it, but there's a price to that. We're seeing that price in the environment. We're seeing that price with farmers' quality of life. We're seeing that with our health in many ways, and we're learning more ways that it's being impacted every day. So I think that's a big issue as well. Another solution that the Savory Institute is developing, there are consumers who want to use their power as consumers to influence what's going on in agriculture. So they are introducing the Land to Market, which is a regenerative sourcing solution. It's verified outcomes. So if you're a producer and you want to verify that your practices are creating certain outcomes, this is a process that they're developing. You may see some products already in the stores. Epic, they have bars there. One of their products is the first to be certified under this new label. And so how they verify that is through the ecological outcome, soil health, biodiversity, ecosystem functions. And I think something like this could be strengthened. You know, I just want to put a plug in with the work that Abe Collins is doing. I think that's a critical piece to evaluating some of the outcomes of this land management system. And another thing that we're doing too is we're engaging the community in the work we're doing. So that's the fun part about working at an educational farm. This year is the environmental studies. Students coming out to participate in ecological outcome monitoring, so they're learning, they're engaging in the work. It doesn't hurt that it's because Miss Classic, you know, it's an easy goal to get them to come in, but they had a great time. And it also helps us collect some of the data. We're also just engaging the general public through citizen science programs, agritourism, farm to school programs, and general education programs. So there's different ways we can reach people, touch people to get the word out. And I think, yeah, Didi, you were saying earlier, there's the sensory piece as well, you know, and I think that that's an important piece of what we bring to people. You know, and really what we're hoping to see are healthy food systems, community, and environment. You know, these are some of the things that we would like to see happen. There's a lot more that can happen, but I really feel that creating regional brands and markets and shifting subsidies away from commodity and large scale shipping our food from out in the Midwest, that's not a good solution. We need to do something different, and we need to change it now. So that would be my plug. And most importantly, an honorable wage and a good quality of life for the people that are producing our food. Both farmers and teachers are some of the most underpaid, undervalued professions in our country, and I think they're doing some of the most important work. So let's acknowledge that. So that would be my plug.
Hi. So name is Ellen Stern-Griswold, and I'm the Policy and Research Director at Maine Farmland Trust. And today I just wanted to provide a little bit of background information on the Northeast Healthy Soils Research Project that Maine Farmland Trust is trying to organize, along with partners such as American Farmland Trust, Maine Climate Table, the Mitchell Center at the University of Maine, Wolfsnike Center for Agriculture and the Environment, Vermont Law School, the Isaac Walton League, and a bunch of other partners throughout the Northeast. So the idea for this research project was that as more states in the Northeast in particular consider legislation to incentivize these types of practices, we really felt like it was important to have an assessment of all of the potential benefits of these types of practices. Because although we've been hearing about a lot of very positive research indicators, we thought it was important to sort of have a document that sort of brings that research together and does an honest and accurate assessment of what the potential benefits are. And we would hope that this document could then be used as a foundational document to both inform and support policies and programs that try and incentivize these types of practices. So in terms of what benefits this analysis will look at, we're talking about climate change adaptation and mitigation, water quality and quantity, and different measures of increased farmer profitability. Given the timeline or some of the activity around climate in Maine, all of a sudden, and luckily after sort of an 8-year period of nothing, we decided as a group that it made sense to focus on Maine first to do the analysis, and then to expand outward to cover other states in the Northeast, but building upon the research efforts that are really underway in many of the other states. We're not trying to duplicate efforts here, but really just bring together those research efforts. So just to say a little bit about what's been happening with Maine and sort of our approach to policy in this area is we've been very supportive of a bill this legislative session that sets long-term emissions reductions goals, but also calls for a very inclusive stakeholder process, including agricultural stakeholders, to update Maine's climate action plan, which hasn't been updated since 2004. And in doing so, calls for the encouragement of natural climate solutions like healthy soils practices. And so we felt like this was a really great opportunity for this assessment to really inform that process. And we've met with several of Governor Mills' people in her administration who are very supportive of this work and do feel like it will be very beneficial in terms of informing the work that they do on climate. So just to give a very brief overview, because again, we're at the very beginning stages of this, we're fundraising right now for this research. The first step of the research process would basically involve an assessment of current practices in Maine, and basically analyze those practices in terms of the level of achievement for soil health. And we feel like this is important because it allows stakeholders to take stock of what's happening so far, and also generate information on what could be implemented on a much broader scale. The next stage of the research would be to sort of synthesize the existing scientific literature and on-farm research efforts that are being done to identify the priority agricultural practices for promoting soil health for each state. So starting with Maine, because we know that there are differences even within the region and even within the states, but sort of looking at what makes the most sense. And that this step will really allow policymakers to be able to hone in on the practices that make the most sense for their state, while also looking at emerging practices and the increased benefits that could be achieved through simultaneous application of multiple practices at the same time. Next, we would gather information on the different state programs and policies that exist throughout the country to incentivize these types of practices, which will really allow stakeholders to compare and contrast these types of policies and programs, figure out how these programs work and why, and again, allow states to figure out which types of policies and programs make the most sense given the particulars of the state. As part of that, we would also assess opportunities for federal support for these types of practices, particularly through the last Farm Bill, as well as catalog opportunities to support these types of practices through the private sector, as well as environmental markets. Next, using sort of an ecosystem services approach, the researchers would estimate the benefits and costs of wide-scale adoption of these types of practices, and also provide estimates about the sort of potential return on investment of adopting certain practices within the state and then again within the region. And this sort of methodology is similar to that which was used in the Natural and Working Lands Opportunity Assessment that was led by the U.S. Climate Alliance, but this time with an emphasis on the agricultural practices that make the most sense within each state. And then finally, the last component of the research is looking at the willingness of farmers and the interest of farmers to adopt these types of practices. In doing that, it'll be an extensive look at what the barriers are to adoption and sort of provide some creative options for ways of overcoming those barriers. And so I think today has been really helpful to sort of hear about what farmers need. And I'd like to see, as a representative of an organization that works with all different kinds of farmers in Maine, I'd really like to see sort of a in-depth research talking to a variety of different types of producers, at least within Maine, in terms of scale and growing practices and type of production, just so that we can really figure out what would make the most sense for different growers. We're, assuming that the barriers that we will find will be sort of either an insignificant or insufficient knowledge of these types of practices that they could be employing, or insufficient technical assistance to help farmers that are trying to transition to these types of practices, financial barriers, and also land use patterns, because we have heard from some of the farmers, at least in Maine, especially in sort of lease scenarios, that there are significant limitations on the types of practices that farmers in those scenarios can adopt. And so thinking through how you overcome those types of barriers will be really important too. And again, as we move outward, we would really look to build upon the work that's already being done in states across the Northeast, but again, just sort of bringing that information together in a document that could hopefully be used across the region, both to support state level efforts as well as regional efforts as well. So I just wanted to give a brief overview since we're in the beginning, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, I'm going to make just a few comments, partly based on some of my own experiences over a fairly long period, and then also just picking up a few points from each of our panelists today. And one of those is, and this came up very early, but it came up often through all of the panel today, and the idea that we need to have, all of the stakeholders, groups and individuals that may not have exactly the same interests, they all need to be involved to figure out how do we as a system move forward to be able to implement practices. And as somebody, I think Sylvain said, this idea that it's local action that makes up global impact. So this is going to happen. We're talking about New England as a region. Ellen just talked about kind of the work they're doing within an individual state, and all of it is appropriate. We need to be thinking about all of these scales and kind of how do they add up to the United States and how do they add up to the entire globe. So there is, I think back being involved in agriculture and research, but also outreach and education for decades, I do not recall a single issue where there was support across as broad a spectrum of interests in the food system as soil health and climate change. It's just, for most of the time, even with agricultural issues, there's like proponents and opponents, and that's just not really the case here. So I think that's, for me, is a cause for optimism that we can bring together a lot of different kinds of interests here. The idea of scales, working at different scales. So I've worked with, 3-acre farm can take, and it's the farm level, but it's also many of the other things that came up here today. What's the role of the cataloged state level initiatives specifically related to soil health that were governmental or extension or educational or farmer driven, starting about a year and a half ago, right, Emily? And still working on it. But I see there, and it takes into account that the needs in Montana are different from the needs in Massachusetts. So it also gives you kind of a catalog of what are different things that we might consider, for example, if we're thinking about New England as a region. There's interaction between state and federal. So I had a phone call yesterday discussing going through some of the federal programs that support farmer adoption, so the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and looking at whether they are actually contributing to soil health or are they actually harming soil health. And that's, you know, we can begin to make progress pretty quickly on those. Even the federal programs, states have a role, and there's a lot of states that have prioritized soil health and maybe to a somewhat lesser extent climate change adaptation and mitigation through those federal programs. So money goes to states, but states still have a role there. So I think that you're thinking about New England and the individual states in New England, you should be looking at what are other sources of ideas, because there's a lot of them out, and one of our challenges is figuring, you know, like, do you know what's going on out there that you might be able to use good ideas so we're not continually reinventing the wheel? I think we're actually making progress on that. It's certainly much clearer now as to where would you go find that information than it was, you know, even 3 years ago. So I think that's definitely a step in the right direction. There was it came up early on about, and multiple times actually, about what are the things that we could measure that actually tell us we're moving in the right direction. And as a scientist, I'm very interested in that, but so are a lot of other organizations, including both public sector and private sector. So I've talked to small companies in the food system, large companies in the food system over the last 2 years, and they're almost uniformly interested in being part of those solutions that came up many times. But we do need a way to track that. And, you know, something short of being able to measure everything all of the time everywhere, which is not realistic, but are there key indicators that might be easier for us? Or that, you know, citizen science came up. Is there ways that we can get, you know, whether it's high school students, college students, kindergartners, it doesn't matter, get them involved so that at least we have a sense of, does this work in the different environments that we're talking about? And I've had a lot of discussions around that. That's a tough one. It takes a lot of resources. There are some regional to national efforts now, both some with governmental funding and some with other sources of funding, that are trying to move forward on that. And certainly USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service, has been a key player in that. And again, compared to where we were 5 years ago, there's been a huge amount of progress from a bunch of different types of organizations coming together, and in this case, all thinking about moving in the same direction rather than moving either in different directions or moving against, you know, other interests. So that's been, I've said 1,000 times, I'm an optimist at heart, so that just like gives me more cause for optimism. We're all pointed in the same direction here. The only other point that I would make is, you know, there in the agricultural sector and in the private sector that, you know, does produce and manufacture and distribute our food, companies and organizations are all starting in different places, whether they're thinking about soil health at all, whether they're thinking about climate impacts at all. Is, you know, that in the United States, agriculture certainly has a really big footprint, literally, land footprint, water footprint, carbon footprint, whatever. And if you want to influence that, you need to be, I think, prepared to meet individuals and companies and organizations kind of where they are now, and see if you can find some level of agreement that we can propose solutions, we can try those solutions, and then we can do that again, and then we can do that again, and we can do it again. But having had, you know, dozens and dozens of these discussions around particularly soil health and climate change in the last 2 or 3 years, as I said at the beginning of my comments, it is the most uniform kind of agreement across a really diverse range of any issue that I can think of in the last 30 years. So that, to me, is like, okay, then when we're done here at 5:45, let's just go do this, right? Let's take it out of the room and let's actually go do it. But I have a lot of optimism about this, and bringing together groups like this that want to learn about it, or they want to walk out the door and they want to go do it, that's exactly where we are right now. So I think that's really exciting. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to open it up to the room. We have, at least 20, 25 minutes. Somebody, one of the organizers, tell me how much time we have. But I want to, have, certainly if you have questions for any of the panel, including myself, you can ask us specifically, you can ask general, you can kind of raise other issues, but we're kind of closing the day now, and I'd like to have it be a conversation with the room. So thanks for your attention, and then I'm just going to kind of open it up to the 5 of us and all of you. Thanks.
30 minutes, actually.
30 minutes. Okay, 30 minutes, and then we go across the street to the reception. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to open it up. Thank you. Yeah, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. I just wanted to take a moment to offer appreciation, particularly to Professor Bill Mumma, who's right here, and everyone else, because 6 years ago, I went to the Africa Center for Holistic Management in Zimbabwe, and I spent 6 weeks with Alan Savory. And when I came back, Bill Mumma was the first academic to invite me to speak to his class. And ever since then, it's just been like this roller coaster. And then Alan Savory came here the very next year, and it's really started right here. Really, in many ways, with Bill Mumma, and I don't know how many people here know this. Sorry, Bill, you may hate me later, but that's what you get. But when Hansen spoke before Congress in 1988, and the most famous climate testimony in the history of humanity said we have to be at 350 or less, you realize there were 4 people on that dais with Hansen, and Bill Mumma was one of those 4 people. Okay, a lot of people don't know. At the time, he was the head scientist for World Resources Institute. He was their head climate guy. So anyway, I just want to give a shout out to him for helping to put together this great event. And also, just one other thing real quick. Didi mentioned the land and the bad land, and we feel hot. Well, there's another issue too, also to add to it, which is the equity issue, right? Because who lives on bad land, right? Poor people. And I have this clothes on because I'm going to Africa in 2 days. I'm going back to Zimbabwe. I'm visiting with my friends in Kenya. We're going to try to do a project on Maasai lands there. So it's all sort of inspired by all of this. So thank you.
Thanks. All right, bring it on. Questions? Yeah.
70 billion tons of topsoil being lost per year. That's 10 tons for every person. And what I think that New England used to get half its protein from the oceans. If y'all can make sure that the soil doesn't roll out into the oceans anymore, we could that could be part of your food plan for New England. But once the oceans are going to rise, are we going to build a wall, or are we going to let living shorelines move inland?
Yeah.
So just another possibility is how do you reverse the dead zones?
Yeah.
Something to think about.
Yeah, which are. That's the part, and that's the issue I'm less optimistic about, because they're not getting any smaller, hardly anywhere. But I mean, it's not like we don't understand what the cause of hypoxic zones are, right? It's like, I've done a lot of work on nitrogen and phosphorus, right? So we know what the root cause is and the cause at the problem. So, but solving it is still local action. I mean, you have to work at the level of individual fields on individual farms. And a lot of the things that came up with the panel are exactly those, kind of categories of practices that we've known about for decades, right? So figuring out where they're not implemented, how do they get implemented is definitely the key here. So, others? Yeah.
One small question. You mentioned somebody, Emily, I think, I'm not sure who that is doing a survey of state practices. How can we get that? Sounds interesting.
Emily, is that on the SHI?
Hey guys, I'm a Penetration student over at the Friedman School in Boston. I've done a fair bit of stuff on soil health. If you're interested in the work, the compilation I'm doing is for the Soil Health Institute, and the first round of that is actually on their website. It's freely accessible. So go to soilhealthinstitute.org and just poke around, it's all there. I'm working on doing an update to it, which is all the private initiatives that are going on. So if you have a private initiative, I probably already know about it, but like, if you really want to make sure it gets on the website, you can talk to me.
How can we get in touch with you? What's your email?
Come by.
Okay, cool.
Great. Yeah, in the back.
Tim, you kind of alluded to it in your closing statements, but I think what you alluded to really ought to just be put out into the fore a little more boldly. We all care about these things. In our little New England states, we can make a difference if we're talking about alternative agriculture, we're talking about regenerative agriculture, we're talking about small agriculture, local food, the food system, all of that works here. You want anything to pass the U.S. Senate, you have to get agriculture as a whole on board. And as long as we talk about differences in agriculture and how big agriculture does this and the rest of us do that, that messaging will never resonate with the majority of the country. The majority of the country being the majority geographically in a number of states, which plays into the role of the Senate. So it's just really important as we talk about the messaging, we talk about the framing, we've got to make it about us. You know, one of the things that I really try to do is I talk about these things, and I've been impressed that we haven't really said that agriculture is a major part of the problem here today, but I always try to talk about agriculture doesn't emit anything for emissions. Society, in an attempt to feed itself, emits all these emissions. Farmers are just trying to do what we all ask them to do. At whatever scale they are, whether they're corporate or family owned, they're just doing what the market wants. So it's our problem collectively, and we need to try to solve it, and we need to make sure we're not putting up those divisions, or else we'll just be able to make change like here in Massachusetts, which isn't going to do it.
It's a great point. Didi, you have something?
Yeah, I wanted to just talk for a minute about regional things, because I think this is really interesting, and one of the great privileges I've had is traveling with the Soil Carbon Coalition throughout North America and to farms, regenerative farms and ranches all around the country and also in Canada. And then I recently got to go to France, which got me thinking about a second thing about regional things. I'll save that one. But in the coast, the left coast and the right coast, or the left and the left, we have. I'm really happy to hear the word soil health being used here more, because we have tended to frame this as soil carbon and as a climate solution. And the same conversations, or not the same conversations, but the same level of interest or more is happening in the other states, but under the term soil health. And the leaders, the real leaders in, other than Jack, the real leaders in soil health management in this country are conservative, Christian, mostly Republican farmers and ranchers in the middle of the country. We don't hear about them here because they're not framing it as a climate issue. They're not framing it as a carbon issue. But we have tremendous leadership in that. And one of the really exciting things is that if you don't see it here, because they don't want to come see us, but if you go to a soil health conference in the Midwest, you'll see people with cowboy hats and rainbow bandanas all looking in the same soil pit. So where there's this incredible coming together of political parties and religious differences, etc., all happy to sit down and eat together, happy to talk together, maybe unfriending each other on Facebook. That's what Gabe Brown did to me during the election. But next time he saw me, he gave me a big hug. So that's one point I want to make, that we think that we're leading this movement. We're not. And here we are in an academic institution, and one of the things that happened in the 1930s with medicine is that all of the medical schools that accepted working class people, people of color, women, or that were teaching holistic thinking in terms of human health, were shut down by the elite academic institutions on the coast that were funded by big money. And that changed the face of how medicine was practiced. And there's a way in which that science then became defined by the coast, especially the East Coast. And so we think, oh, because we're on the East Coast, that we're the smarty pants. But we don't have that experience of managing huge tracts of land, or what the peer pressure is of trying to make that shift, which is another thing we haven't talked about. Okay, one last thing, then I'll sit back down. So I was recently invited to France to speak there, and at the end of the conference, wonderful conference, there's one other person here who was there. I was like, who is this who's putting this conference on? And it turns out it's this group called Ver de Terre Productions, which means Earthworm Productions. And I got to talk to the person who started it. His family had a farm that had been continuously in his family for hundreds of years, but his parents stopped farming, and he and his brother went off into high tech and high finance. Well, then they realized food was important, wanted to figure out how to farm again, realized they didn't know anything. And so then they had the money and the tech, so they made 500 hours of video about how to farm regeneratively. And he said to me, have you seen our YouTube channel? And I said, no. He said, yeah, we have 500 hours. And I said, well, are there subtitles in English? And he said, no. And I said, well, are you planning to? And he said, no. We want to be the best. We're French, right? So, and that actually changed my thinking, because I'm like, that's actually one thing that's kind of missing in the soil health movement in the States, is healthy competition. It wasn't cutthroat. He wasn't saying you can't watch them. It's just like, pay for your own damn So that's, and I think here, one of the things that I'm hopeful for about having a New England meeting is, where is our sense of regional pride? Or, Vermont pride, Massachusetts pride, New England pride, in terms of we know how to grow food, and we know how to grow soil. So it's different than the whole thing about how do we collaborate, but it's another piece of the picture, and it does tap into human nature very nicely.
Do any of the other panelists want to talk about that particular issue?
Well, the one thing I would say is, so I participate with several other people who are here on this National Healthy Soils Policy Group, and I think it's been really instructive, because although there are definitely many members from the Northeast, there are people who participate from the Midwest and the West, and hearing how they sort of frame the discussion, particularly some of the people who participate in the Midwest, and for them it's all about water quality. Right, like building water quality through these practices, and so I think that is a really important point to think about how we're communicating, and sort of, because I think there are a lot of areas where our interests intersect, but the same pitch is not going to work with every group.
Yeah. Anybody else? Sylvain,
I'm not sure I'm very competent to speak about the way forest is managed in the US. Just maybe to say one thing. Transition is always difficult, and when we still are trying to mainstream agroecology and soil health with our farmers. And a lot of them said, well, you told me 30 years ago to go with chemicals, to go with pesticides, to go with mechanization, to be modern. And then you want to come back to what my grandfather was doing, and we're saying, well, first we have to acknowledge the farmers did what they were told, and I think it was already said that it's very important to acknowledge that. And second, saying, well, we put you not in the good direction, and it's not your fault, it's our fault, it's also the fault of the public authorities. We are not going back to what our grandfathers were doing, because it's not what we want. We want to see with modern eyes what they were doing, realizing and understanding what right they were doing, and using that with all the science and technology we have to make tomorrow's agriculture. No, that was
Jack?
I just, to back up what Didi said, there's a book that I would recommend to everybody here if you want to read about what's happening about soil health and cover cropping and people using less chemicals on conventional farms, and it's called Growing a Revolution by David Montgomery, who's a geologist by trade, or a soil health geologist, I think. He also wrote a book, Dirt and the Decline of Civilizations. He was just a speaker at the Vermont Grass Farmers Conference recently. But he doesn't even talk about the Northeast in this book. It's mostly based in places like South Dakota and in Africa. So it's have a read. It's a great book, and it'll really turn your head around.
Yeah, he's done some really important, on the science side. Chris and I used some of his work on soil erosion. We've been using it for 10 years because we haven't found a good replacement for it. He's an amazing scientist and writer. He's been doing a lot the last 5 years especially. So, is there another question? Yes.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. I'm kind of new to this field. I'm the board chair of Stonewall Farm with Davenson. Stonewall Farm in this southwest corner of New Hampshire, a nonprofit. We invite all of you here, to your friends and families, and who want to come to see a working small farm and actually see it in action. We welcome you there. I just feel really inspired by all of you that we are a small wheel in a small cog in a big wheel right now, but I really feel like there's a lot of momentum going on. And the fact that Stonewall Farm is trying to help you with this education piece. That's one of our main goals, is to educate others through holistic land management. We have a conference coming up in a couple of weeks on holistic land management at Stonewall Farm. Again, we encourage everybody to come and see it, and and we look at these young faces here. I mean, this is where it all starts. Is if we can start looking down at our youth and bring in all of this thought processes to these young people.
And then I think there's a number of examples of farms like Stonewall that are actually in all of the New England states. So I'm on the board at Wolf's Neck Center in Freeport. And, grazing-based area right on the ocetion. So if you want to go see things, it's not hard to go see it. So yeah, thank you for that.
It's especially important with children from cities. I was born in Paris. My link with farm came late when I started to work, and I really think I missed something. So I think this outreach is also a very good way to connect back cities to rural areas, and to be able to give back a link to food, a real food with dog children. So it's very important.
I think we should connect with the youth that is striking for climate, because there is such a big movement now, and this is an opportunity to give them hope. Right. They can do something.
Did you?
Yeah. I want to encourage everybody to get your neighbors when the snow thaws and go dig a hole and look at worms and roots and aggregates, and bring a magnifying glass with you and a ruler, and you will all leave so inspired, and you will think differently about the soil, and so will they, and then they'll do it with their friends, and they'll do it with their friends. I do this at schools. I do this with adults. We did this at Jack Blazer's farm, and it was one of the most amazing experiences to see Jack's soil after 2.5 months of drought with aggregates, 14, 16, and 20 inches down into the ground, and that's just as far as our shovel went. So it's really exciting, and I think that kind of enthusiasm is what we need people to go into the grocery store with. And that's how we change things.
Just like to offer that NOFA Mass is the lead agency on a multi-state conservation innovation grant project, which is an NRCS program. And we will be having field days at no-till. This is focused on organic no-till vegetable operations, but we'll be having field days in New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts on 2 farms per year for the next 3 years, where we'll have equipment demos, we'll have microscopes looking at soil, we'll have no-till farmers coming to guest lecture, we'll have a variety of really fun things to do at those field days. So if there's one happening near you, we'd love to have you. And you can find those events at nofamass.org/events or on our Interstate Council website, and I can send a link out to the organizers if that's helpful. So,
Thank you. Others? Questions or comments or things that are going on that you want everybody to know? Yeah, John.
So it's been influencing consumer demand. Julie, you mentioned labeling. I guess as a consumer, I kind of have label fatigue already. I guess just asking the panel broadly, and anyone in this room, I guess, like what role really labeling versus just education about buying local plays in supporting this movement?
Make a very non-American answer about that, and I know that I will be out of context, but official logos, like the organic sales that's used here, organic, it does not say you've got one thing, one logo on a lot of product with one common thing. It's not labeling, and the fact, I'm not American while saying that, the fact that it's with the public authority giving that can give confidence, and there is a great confidence in all the USDA seals and the organic seal. Maybe that's something that could be done. We were thinking about that in Europe with the high environmental quality. The idea to have something, the problem is that it has to be with water, with biodiversity, with climate, and it's very difficult to have something that's going on. But maybe that's also a simple thing that can be done, and then you don't need a magnifying lens to read the label of the product because nobody does that.
Any other thoughts on labeling from anyone?
I've been thinking about this for a while, and on the one hand, I don't like the idea of separating good farmers from bad farmers. I think all farmers are good farmers, and I'd like to move everybody ahead one step at a time from wherever they are. On the other hand, as a consumer, I do read labels a lot, and I think if we were to go with the soil health principles and think about something that was kind of color-coded, or or a little like how many of those dots are filled in. So I would like to know, is this food grown in a no-till system? Is it, are there cover crops year-round? Are there animals integrated into the system, etc.? That might be a way of doing it in a kind of a visual way. I also think there's like those seafood labels, the red, yellow, green. It's something that's kind of mobile, so it shows where some of that in a process.
There are some private sector players that are working on that with farmers who supply products into their supply chain. And right now they're using it internally actually to encourage or provide incentives for farmers to adopt exactly what we're talking about. But I haven't talked to them about whether that would be an outward-facing thing, where the products from my farm, I am using all these practices, and would it carry that into the marketplace and then benefit that farmer? Yeah. That I don't know what they're thinking. They're just trying to meet some broader sustainability goals with that. So yes.
So it's me again. Our farm has done absolutely amazing, wonderful things, and we helped to educate and spread these practices throughout a greater product. And sort of a lot of my skepticism and experience comes from that whole process, because really I need to be stepping back and processing and marketing my milk, because it's it is regenerative, but because it feeds into a product that is basically becoming commodified because it's now widespread, now everybody's hands are tied, and now there's all these labeling issues and there's this communication issue. So I just really feel like there's some real work that has to be done to bring the commodities into this, those anonymous products. Because
All right, so we have time for just a couple more. Yeah, in the back.
I think the idea of labeling is a real challenging one. For people like us, it adds a lot of information. It educates. For people who are looking at 10 labels on the back of a box, it removes any need to actually know about your food system. They can just feel good because this box has 10 labels and that box only has 6. And most people who care about GMO labeling, either they love GMOs or they hate GMOs, but they don't know anything about them. They're passionate, but they're not educated at all, most people, when they're reading about those. So making sure that we don't find some comfort in just putting a label on it. There are a couple labels I've seen that do a good job of educating, but I think that's a really good point. If a label doesn't educate, it does more harm than good in my mind for the food system. All it does is divide farmers and continue to allow people to be educated and not get to understand the food system.
Great. Any others? Am I going to give you the last word, Dr. I was going to, even if there was another question after that, I was going to ask you if you have one.
Let's take some others first. Go ahead.
Okay.
I was just thinking in terms of all this, but then you have the people who understandably are not looking for that information. What they're looking for absolutely is how can they afford to feed their families.
Absolutely.
So where's the intersectionality here, do you think? Between...
Where do I think? I mean, this is one of the really grand challenges here is, and this came up a little bit earlier, talking about kind of anonymous commodities and how do you retain some identity so that if you're doing those things to improve soil health, that you share the benefit, the economic benefit. The other side of that coin is if you can't afford healthy food now and the costs go up, then that's all of our problem. And this is an area that I and a lot of my colleagues spend a lot of time thinking about. It's like, what are all of the different impacts of what we're talking about? So soil health and climate change are important, but that's not everything. If you can't afford a good food, healthy food for your family now, and it goes up by 20%, what are you left with? So even just the stage we're at is, how do we actually think about what those, in some cases they're trade-offs, right? We're going to get a better outcome here and a worse outcome here, and are we actually willing to do that? I'm also interested in what the synergies are, so it doesn't have to be win-lose. It could be that there are win-wins, but I'm not completely sure what they are. Yeah, Brian.
It's not that complicated to me. A living wage would help.
Yeah. Sure.
And the political power to cause more soil health stuff to happen for farmers is the same political power that would deliver a living wage. It's not complicated to me. I'm sorry. Making these changes.
Yeah, it's hard. And some of it could be government done by government, and then what are the potentially, if there was the political will to do so. But then what are the roles of the other sectors in being able to balance those different outcomes is a huge challenge.
Well, that's precisely what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Inevitably, you end up with the question of political will.
Yep.
And therein lies the rub, particularly nowadays. So.
Yeah. See, now I got like 5 hands, and I said, okay, 2 questions. Very quick, you haven't asked a question.
Well, just in addition to the political will piece, there is also the place where we can leverage collective action through pressure on markets. And you mentioned some of the private companies that are trying to create some sort of labeling system. I know one called How Good, which is a really interesting app where you can scan the barcode and it looks not only at how is this food grown, but how is it processed and how is the conduct of the company that's producing this acting in the world. And so it's also putting pressure on the larger companies.
Yeah, and some of that is becoming easier just because technology allows us to do it, and it's possible that it could be more transparent, not less so. So there's possibilities there. I think we're gonna stop, and I'm sure you can grab the people you want to talk to. I just want to say, Bill and Anne Marie, do you want to just give any last comment before we break?
Just, those comments that just were made are very, I think are very appropriate. And in fact, some of these things are right here on this slide. I've been looking at it the whole time that everybody's been talking. And there are two issues. One is a question of, that makes things work or not work is whether it's perceived as fair. And the other factor is trust. And let me just elaborate on each of those. There's several things up there that just aren't fair. Shift government subsidies from commodities to small regional farm producers and systems. Why do we have